Want to know how to prepare a cut piece of copper sheet to be used for making a piece of jewelry? With 3 simple steps, you can prepare a basic shape to become a custom jewelry component. They're super easy, but often overlooked. Good preparation makes your final result appear more refined and is a sign of quality in your handmade jewelry. Hi, I'm Jen Hanscom of Jewelry Classes with Jen, your online source for learning how to make quality, consistent jewelry right from home. In this video, I will show you how to punch holes, file, and sand a cut piece of copper sheet, transforming it into what we think of as a custom copper blank, ready to be adorned with your personal touch and assembled into a piece of handmade jewelry. Plus, I've included some really great bonus tips for you to get the best results possible. Before we get started, there's a few tools that we're going to use. First up, we need a 1.5 millimeter hole punch pliers. I like this size because it's large enough to use either 16 or 18 gauge jump rings to make the connections. Then you'll also need a jewelry grade file. My first choice is a Swiss made number 4 cut half round file. But if you already own something close, there's no need to buy another one. If you're looking to minimize expenses as you begin your jewelry making journey, you can also use a needle file, which is just a smaller version. I still highly recommend a great quality file though, so use the link in the description below to take a look at my tool reference page where I describe what you should look for in a good jewelry file. Next up, we have emery paper. I like to use a silicone carbide wet or dry paper, which is commonly available through jewelry supply sources and hardware stores like Home Depot. We use a variety of grits for jewelry making in general, but for this beginner task, 400 and 600 grit should serve you well. I cut the sheet into smaller pieces, so if you have a friend learning with you, you can share. Just remember to mark the grit on the back of each piece. And then finally, I use 3M sanding sponges. These are fabulous for that final sanding. I typically use just 3 grits, the superfine, ultrafine, and microfine. I use the acronym SUM, S-U-M, to remember the order of the grits, superfine being the most aggressive of the 3 and microfine for the finest of the finishes. Now that we're set for tools, we need some copper to work with. In the jewelry world, there is a product out on the market considered to be what they call a copper blank, or it could be a silver blank. But basically, what a blank is it's a basic shape of metal. Sometimes they have holes pre-punched, and the shape is somewhat cleaned up. The edges are not fabulous, but they're not bad. And then basically they're just kind of like a canvas for you to be able to make your own custom blanks. These happen to be a couple of really nice shapes I found at Lima Bead, but it can be difficult to find shapes that are really classic jewelry shapes. A lot of things are very shape oriented, get to be a little bit busy for my taste. And so when I want to show off what I'm doing to a piece, I like to work with some more kind of, I call them classic shapes. And so when they're simple shapes like this, I can cut them on my bench shear because I can cut these nice straight edges. And therefore I can offer these great shapes to you at very reasonable prices. The thing here is that the edges are literally just the cut edge that comes off of my shear, and there are no connection holes in this case. However, pieces that don't have a connection hole, that can really be in your favor because, like, look at this. Like I said, this is a nice shaped diamond pendant piece, but look at how close that hole is to the edge. It'll last for a little while, but if that takes a lot of strain, it'll probably wear through. And so on the shape that I cut, I leave it a little bit wider up there so that you're able to punch a hole and have still a good perimeter of metal around the edge. And so because I offer these shapes that I happen to prefer on my website, I wanted to provide you with a video about how you need to prepare these pieces in order to use them for something fun like painting with patina. So it's a 3-step process. First, we're going to punch a hole, then we're going to file the edges, and then we're going to sand the surface. Simple, right? All right, so let's get started. Our first step is to figure out where we want to have the holes so that we can punch them. So if you're going to make an earring like this, for instance, you need to have a hole at the top that you can connect your ear warrior to, and then if you want to have something dangling from the bottom, you'll need another hole down here in order to connect whatever you're going to dangle. If you want to have multiple things dangle, then you can have multiple holes, and so design options are virtually limitless. But if you're just getting started, I like to work with these graph rulers. They're just really nice and handy because they're see-through, and they also sit really flush to the surface of the metal, and so that makes it easy to be able to draw guidelines for yourself. And so you'll notice if you're trying to make an earring like that and you want to mark the corners, you can just draw a diagonal line from corner to corner to help you figure out where you want to align your holes. Then you want to make a dot that's about the same size as the pin on the hole punch. If you have not used a hole punch before, this is a 1.5 millimeter handheld hole punch. I have a whole separate video about how to set your gauge guard, how to properly set up your pin, and some other great tips about punching holes. So if you're not familiar, definitely check out that video as well. But the size of the pin is going to be the size of the hole. And so if we make a dot on our copper blank that's about the same size as the pin, it's going to help us to align the hole well. And so I usually like to draw a dot on my copper piece that's about the size of the pin so that I can really see, is that pretty well centered on there? And I want to leave enough space surrounding the hole so that there's a good amount of metal to hold the piece together, so that over time as pieces rub, it's not too close to the edge. And so then I'm going to draw another one down at the bottom edge as well. And so if I feel like my hole is, or my dot is not really centered, then I just kind of make it a little bit bigger and try to punch the middle of it. That gives me a good idea though. And then I go ahead and I line up my pin to my dot. I'm going to check from the side view as well as looking down the jaw of the plier so I can see two different directions whether or not I'm aligned well. Double check that, and then I just punch the hole. That worked out pretty well. And then I'm going to punch the other one up here. Again, I'm just looking at the side view as well as looking down the jaw of the plier. Looks pretty even to the other side. Double check here. Punch that hole. So that looks pretty good. So now here's a trick. When you're doing a pair of earrings, you can use the first one layered over the other one, and then you can just use the holes from your first one like a pattern to mark where you're going to punch holes on the other piece so that you're sure to have equal pieces. And so now if I stack those two pieces together, the holes are really quite well aligned. They're not perfect, but they're pretty close. And so I'm pretty happy with that. So now we have the holes punched. But now if you rub your finger on the back side, there's a little flange that's left from the hole punch. And so I'm going to use my trusty round cutting burr fitted into a handheld pin vise, and I'm going to use that with a little bit of lubricant to clean up the back side of the hole. You can see that by spinning that in place, that's allowing me to clean off just that little flare of metal that's left from punching the holes. If you want more information about the specific techniques on how to punch a hole, how to set up the tool using the pin vise with the round cutting burr, that kind of a thing, I do have another video that's specific to that, and it is linked up in the description below. And so once you go ahead and clean up all of the holes, that will make it easier to then clean the whole piece. But since you need the holes to connect your pieces, I find that I like to start with that first. Then for whatever reason, if your hole is, maybe it's just went a little bit off course from where you wanted it to be, you can then file to adjust, make it a little bit more appealing to the eye. If you're working with a rectangle blank like this and you want to have a hole at the top center, not everybody is good with using a ruler to measure. So here's a great tip, a little shortcut. If you cut a piece of paper, and basically you trace the shape, this is just a scrap piece of paper. I'm going to just trace the shape onto the paper. Cut that paper out. Now what you can do is you can fold that piece of paper in half. Make sure you get a nice good crease on that. And what happens is that crease will help you to mark the center. I'm going to just draw a line on the crease for you so you can see it, because it's not filming very well. But if that's the fold crease right there. And then I'm going to drop it down on the blank just a little bit, because I want to make sure I leave enough material over the hole. Make sure I center that piece to the blank, and now when I draw a dot for my hole to be punched, that hole will be in the center of the blank. In a shape like this, it's important that we have the real center, because if the hole is off, like if the hole was closer to the left, the blank will hang a little bit askew this way, or if the hole is closer to the right, the blank will hang a little askew that way. Might be very, very slight, but this way It's a really good way to get a fighting chance of finding the center by folding a piece of paper that's the same size. Step 2 for preparing a blank is to file the edges. If you're using blanks purchased through my website, you know that I have just cut them on my bench here. So the corners might be a touch sharp, but the straight edges are going to be fairly clean and need very little cleanup. If you're filing a flat edge though, what you're doing, you want to support the piece on the table. Notice I've got a piece of cardstock here. That's just a trashy piece of cardstock. You could use like an old file folder or something like that. I just use that to help from scratching my work surface, especially if you're working on a surface that you don't want to mar. And then what I want to do is I want the flat side of the file. Well, let me just back up here 1 minute. I'm using a number 4 cut half round file. So that means that one side of the file is rounded and the other side is flat. A good quality file is something that you really want to have. It's probably the first bigger ticket item that I would have you spend money on. So be sure to take a look at the link below in the descriptions about files and where to purchase them and that kind of thing, and talk about the different grits and that. If you don't have as much of a budget, I would still get a nice quality file, number 4 half round. I would just get a needle file size, because when you're first starting out, you don't necessarily need to have a big file. When you're working with sheet pieces, it is nice to have a bigger file, but it'll be quite a while before you really have to have that bigger file. And you can certainly get by with a needle file, which is something that you'll need down the road anyway. And so, as I say, I have links to descriptions and where you can purchase these 2 types of files. And so I'm going to demonstrate with the larger file. And so I'm going to support the piece on the table, because when the piece is stabilized, I am doing more work with every stroke. I want to make sure that I hold the flat side of the file so that it's perpendicular to the edge. So this copper piece is perpendicular, and then the flat plane of the file is parallel with the surface of the table. And notice that I'm not going at a perpendicular angle across the edge, because if I do that one stroke, what's going to happen is I'm going to get a little valley, and somewhere along I'm going to get the edge of the file is going to make little valleys. So I want to go at a 45-degree angle, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to push forward and sideways at the same time. So I'll start at this left side of the middle and I'll work my way to the right as I'm pushing forward. Do you see that? There, it's just a quick little stroke. Now there's not a whole lot of pressure because the grit of the file, when you buy a good file, that's why you want to spend the money on it, it does all the work for you. And so then what you can do is you can just rotate that 1/4 of a turn, and you can get the next flat side. And like I said, there's not a lot of work required because I cut these on my bench here, so they're very straight edges. Not like if you had cut them with a jeweler's saw yourself. I'll get to that, cutting your own custom shapes with a jeweler's saw, in another video. But for now, I just want to help you to be able to get these basic shapes refined enough so that you can make jewelry with them. So now we've got the edges are done and they're perpendicular. If you can see, it's almost what we want is like the edge of a nickel. So we want the edge to be perfectly flat the whole way. Then the corners, like I said, are a little bit sharp. So you want to, again, my hand is braced on the table, and then I'm going to take my file, I'm using the flat side of the file, and I'm going to just taper that corner just a little bit. Just a couple strokes, not a lot of pressure. And let's see if you can see that. See how that rounded that edge of the piece just a very tiny bit? And so now if I just flip the piece over, look at, you can even see that extra little flange of metal coming off from filing. So now I'm going to do that same thing on this other side. And so the piece is still what I consider to be a square piece, but if you look, it's a slightly rounded corner now as compared to the very sharp one. Just slightly. All I did was make it so that the corner, if it rubs into something, it's not going to hurt. Then sometimes from filing, there's a little bit on each edge. So you can either, on the corners, you can use the flat side to just kind of, I'm just going to try to show you the angle that I'm filing at. You see how I'm just kind of taking off any little extra bit that might be at the corner to just tone that down. On these edges, if you get a flare on the edges from filing the long edges, I use the round side for that. And again, just a couple very light strokes, it just tones down that edge. And so then you'll want to go through and do all 4 of the corners. Remember, it's just a few strokes. One that way, and then I flip the piece over to do the other side of that same corner. And then I'm just gonna the top a little bit, the bottom just a little bit. And so you can see now I've got 2 nicely rounded corners, and these 2 I'll still need to do, but I'm not gonna bore you with watching me do those on film. And so if you happen to have purchased a blank like this, see, look at how close that hole is to the edges. There's nothing you can do to add metal there. And so you really don't want to do anything to file down that very tip either, because there's really not a lot of metal. You know, but you could also tone down your corners on these commercial blanks if you want to as well. And if you had a blank that was shaped like this, you just have more corners, more sides. If you don't have good hands, or your hands get sore while you're working, you can use something like this rubber jaw vise that just clamps onto the edge of your table to hold your piece. Then that way you can go ahead and file across. And your other hand is free, so you don't have to hold that piece. Notice even as I'm doing that flat side, I'm starting at the right and working my way to the left, making that, because I've got that angle of that file, so that I can get that whole nice long edge without making any valleys. Likewise, you could do your corners by just setting it up in the vise so that you can reach the corner. There's more adjusting, but it does save your hands, so if you have bad hands, that's a good option. The other option, if you have bad hands, is to, here, let me just take that vise out of the picture here. This is what's called a ring clamp. And so what happens is you can hold a piece in one end, and then you put the wedge in the opposite end, and now you've got something good to hold with your hand for filing. And that works in either end, so you can have the piece in the more squared end if you prefer. Put the wedge in the opposite end, and then you can go ahead and file with that. And so those are just 2 ways to save your hands when it comes to filing, especially if you're filing a lot of pieces. And the other thing I just wanted to mention to you too as a bonus tip is that when you're filing, you want to make sure that your material starts at the tip of the file and works towards the tang. I'm not a fan of using a file handle. A lot of people do. This tang just wedges into like a wood handle. But I have a tendency, I like to hold the file a little bit further up like this so that I have more control over the file itself. Everyone's a little bit different with that, and so you can decide what you like. But I've seen people that really like to kind of work backwards. They like to have a pull stroke instead. And so I have them hold the tip of the file so that they can work backwards like this. Everyone, like I say, is a little bit different. The point is that the material needs to start at the tip of the file and work towards the tang. And so if you notice, when I push, I lift off a little bit, I push, I lift off a little bit. That's because if I drag back, all I'm doing is clogging the file. The file actually has direction to the grit, and so in that forward stroke it's cutting more. In the backward stroke, it's really just going to clog your material. So again, very light strokes, everything's braced, and that nice smooth stroke. Step 3 is sanding. Sanding, I like to use silicone carbide waterproof paper. This is made by 3M. I think that you can start with 400 and 600 grit to get started. Each sheet is the size of, say, a piece of paper. But so I cut them down into smaller pieces, maybe like 1/9 of the page or 1/8 of the page, something like that. And then I fold it in half so that it's a size that fits in my hand pretty well. This one happens to be 600 grit. How do you know what grit that you need to work with? Really, the answer to that question is all has to do with the condition of the copper that you're sanding. See how this particular piece has some scratches on the surface. They're not too deep or anything, and the emery paper is actually going to create a scratch. But unless it's real bad, I just start with the 600. If it wasn't enough to totally get rid of that scratch, then I would go to a coarser grit, which would mean a lower number, so then the 400 grit. But I'm just going to show you with this blank. Notice using my other hand, I've got rubber gloves because sanding is messy. If you get copper dust in around your fingernails, it will become green, and so that's not so easy to wash off. And so I just let you know that, so that in case you're making some jewelry before you're heading out on a nice hot date or something, you don't want to go out with green fingernails. But you see how the 600 grit isn't quite enough to get through some of those deeper grooves in there. You see, as I wipe away, there's still a little bit of that line going in the other direction. So then that's when I would bump up to the 400 grit. There's also 320, 280, 220. But usually the blanks that you get are in fairly decent shape. But when I use a rougher grit paper, that makes it so that the satin finish that's left is not showcasing that stripe that goes across. And so therefore, and do that whole piece that, now this wasn't the piece that I was actually working on, I just knew I had it as a piece that had a deeper scratch. And so once I've used the 400 grit, then I need to use the 600 grit again because it's smoother. And so you just go back to the 600 grit paper. Notice all the pieces that I cut, I mark on the back what the grit is, so that, because once you've cut them, it's very difficult to discern what the grit is unless you happen to cut a piece of paper with the number printed on it. But this way you can get that sanding done. Now notice my sanding is done in a linear pattern. I don't want to work in circular fashion. I want to be one directional so that the emery paper leaves a satin finish on the piece. You see how that's, try to show you that in the reflection, but see how it leaves a regular satin finish. And we have gone as deep as any of those deepest grooves were on that piece, and then of course you want to do the other side. And so when you have a piece, I'm just going to go back to that square one I was using in my little sample. When you have a piece that has holes, you're going to notice that it's hard to get the emery paper to really sand evenly around where the holes are punched, because there's likely little puckers in the texture from where the hole is. And so once you do the 600 grit paper and you have that smoothness, again on this piece I didn't have to do the 400 because I didn't have any deeper abrasions on the surface, so I only have the 600 grit. And then I'll file the other side. Now remember, we cleaned up the flange from the holes by using that round burr fitted in the pin vise, and so it's a little bit easier to sand across those holes. Notice I'm still trying to work in that linear pattern, and you can see the mess that I'm talking about. That's why you know, it's definitely good to have that disposable work surface that you don't really care about. But you can see here what I mean about where the holes were punched. There's still some areas that aren't really touched, and so that's when I use sanding sponges. These are 3M sanding sponges. These happen to be cut. This is like a fourth of one of the sponges when you buy it. But that's the super fine grit. You could either fold it like a taco in order to get that fold to press in, or you can kind of wrap it around your index finger so that you could get some pressure just right at the hole where you're trying to get that deeper. But the sanding sponges, what's nice about those is that because the give of the sponge, they'll get into any slight valleys and they'll leave a smoother finish. You see, you look at how nice and smooth that satin finish is. And that's the superfine, which is the roughest of those 3 grits. It goes superfine, then ultrafine, and then microfine are my favorite grits for the sanding sponges. And then what this has done for you is it's cleaned up the whole surface. We have no outstanding marks, just the satin finish that's left from the actual sanding process. And then you could go through the ultrafine and microfine sanding sponges as well, but this piece is now pretty well prepared to have something done with it. The edges have been sanded and smoothed. You can also use the emery paper or the sanding sponges on the edges if you like. The emery paper itself can sometimes be easier to get that smoothed up. But now your piece really is in some good shape. And so if you're following along and this is one of your first projects and you're going to try the painting with liver of sulfur, then you're going to want to do just a little bit more sanding as the preparation process for that first step of the patina, just to make this surface as refined as possible. If you're going to do something else with the piece, like add a hammer texture or something else, then you're good to go because you're going to have to sand and polish again anyway. If you found this video informative, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. But not only that, you'll want to sign up for my emails as well. I consistently send out gems of knowledge about the art of making jewelry. I love to share my tips and tricks about how to craft with quality. You know, the tidbits they skip over in the magazines that help you improve your craftsmanship. Sign up for our emails today. In your first email, you'll get my free guide, How to Create Consistent Components with Ease Using Measuring Charts. This guide explains how I use measuring charts to craft consistent jewelry components, much like a seamstress uses a pattern to make clothing. When you combine the use of measuring charts with solid forming fundamentals, you too will be crafting consistent quality components. Go to jewelryclasseswithjen.com/free-guide to sign up. You can find the link below in my description. I truly look forward to sharing the art of making jewelry with you, and you'll love being a part of our jewelry making community.